Once it gets late in the season in soybeans, it's difficult to get great weed control out there and not damage the soybeans a little bit, but that's what farmers are trying to do in some cases.
You know what, Brian? I would say this too. We're seeing huge differences this year where pre-emerge herbicides were used, and also we're seeing big differences where one pre-emerge herbicide was used versus 2 or 3, as we've been talking about the last couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially as you get later on in the season with soybeans. The thing you got to remember is with corn plants, they give you crop canopy so much earlier in the season. Same thing with a wheat crop. When you get crop canopy, that's the best weed killer there is. When you have crops like soybeans and sunflowers that don't offer great early season crop canopy, what that means is your residual products have to do a lot of work. And in some cases, if you don't have more than one pre-emerge herbicide out there in soybeans and sunflowers, those types of crops, you're just not going to have enough residual control to get you up to canopy, especially as you go into wider rows. So this is why later on in the season, a lot of farmers do have quite a few weed escapes.
You know, a couple of things worthy of mention here is fertility made a huge difference this year. A lot of areas across the country had some heavy early season rains. Where there was good fertility, the crop really took off once the sun came back out, and those fields shaded out the rows much quicker. On our farm, we did some 10-inch rows this year compared to 30-inch rows, like you were mentioning with that row spacing, made a huge difference. And then also, we saw a number of farmers varying planting population this year, going back up from some of the low planting rates like 120,000 plants per acre in a 30-inch row, back up to that 150, 160, maybe even a little bit more. And that made a big difference too. You can really see the rows filled in much more quickly, and the weed escapes were much fewer.
Yeah, so this is one of the things, you know, it's not all about what herbicide you use. It is sometimes just about, hey, let's try to raise as good a crop as we can, get that crop up and growing. And once you do that, it's going to shade out those weeds and kill the weeds all by itself. But let's talk about at this point in the year, what are you going to do? How are you going to get herbicide control? One of the things you may have to consider is calling in a plane. If you've got narrow rows and you don't have tram lines like we do on our farm with our drill, you know, to drive down drilled beans this late in the year, I sure wouldn't do it. I'd call in the plane and have that flown on. The number one weed I'm looking at right now is actually volunteer Roundup Ready corn. Another thing that happened this year, because of all the rain, because of all the volunteer Roundup Ready corn, because we had 2 flushes in so many fields, there are many of the good volunteer corn products that got sold out as we went throughout the season. There are a few that are still left out there. Just keep in mind that there are many different products you can use. Make sure though, if you're spraying taller corn, you use a little higher rate.
The other thing is look at that rate and talk to your agronomist, because you may be used to using, say, Select Max, for example, and you can't find any more of that, but you can find generic Select. Those are completely different products. They've got much different use rates. So make sure if you are switching around between different products on volunteer corn control that you're using the right one. The other thing is we've seen huge differences this year in using the right additives versus no additives versus the wrong additives. What I'm mainly talking about here is if you think, okay, I'm using it with a loaded glyphosate, I'll just tell you right now, if you want good volunteer corn control, that's not enough surfactant, and it's not the right surfactant to make the volunteer corn herbicides work. Using non-ionic surfactant is definitely an improvement, and we've seen the best control where we're using like a crop oil, for example, at about 1 gallon per 100. Some will use up to 1 quart per acre. It just depends on where you're at, what your weather's like. But using some oil really seems to improve the effectiveness of these products. But again, there's so many different volunteer corn products. Make sure you work with your agronomist on the specific product that you're using.
When it comes to broadleaf control this late in the season, it's really tough. Most of the products, let's face it, you probably shouldn't even use them because you're either going to damage the soybeans or you're going to leave carryover for next year. FlexStar, for example, has a 10-month rotational restriction to corn. And I know a lot of people love to use FlexStar. We like to use it on our farm too if we have some water hemp or pigweed, even ragweed escapes early on in the season. But this late in the year, there's absolutely no way I'd ever use FlexStar or generic FlexStar. There's just too much risk for carryover.
The other thing you have to look at is the pre-harvest interval on a number of these products. Now, some of them will say you can't use them after the soybeans are blooming, so obviously those products are out. But even if you could use those products relatively safely this late in the season in soybeans, you have to watch that pre-harvest interval.
I'm not that worried about the pre-harvest interval though. We've still got plenty of time until harvest. It's not that big a concern, but it's certainly something that you can talk to your agronomist about if you're worried about it, if you're expecting an early harvest in your area.
You know, when we think about which weed species are popping up late, the regular culprits are out there, the palmer, pigweed, and tall water hemp, but there are some other weeds too, like black nightshade. We've gotten quite a few calls about black nightshade around the country. You know, everybody's been focused on pigweed
All right, well, let's
control
run through,
so
yeah,
long.
but let's run through very specifically. If you've got nightshade out there this late in the year, Pursuit would be the best way to go, but just understand, Pursuit or Raptor, but just understand they're not very good at killing nightshade that's over 3 inches tall. The residual, though, certainly would help out on anything yet to come during the season. And then if you've got these pigweed or ragweed species that are popping up this late, I'd probably go with Cobra or Cadet. They're both going to burn the beans, but that's just the way it goes. You have to hope that you're going to get some rain after you spray, and then things will turn out all right. The big thing you're weighing out here is it worth it to spray versus how much damage are these weeds going to do? If you've got a lot of weeds out there, they really can still hurt your yield. So you want to try to get them controlled if you have enough.
Okay, here's another question for you. Lamb's quarters. You could use something like Harass. It doesn't have any soil residual, but is it going to be too hard on the beans this late?
That's just something you have to weigh out. No, I don't want to spray Harass this late in the year. That's the old Pinnacle, if you remember that from 20, 25 years ago. But I would do it if I had lots of lamb's quarters out there. So it's a real judgment call when you get to this late in the season with all these broadleaf weeds. With the volunteer corn, absolutely spray. It costs $2 or $3 an acre to spray, nothing to it, and it's going to be pretty safe for the soybeans.
Well, to wrap things up, just keep in mind, if you've got some late season weed escapes, there are things that can be done for next year's crop so you don't run into this again, including increasing planting population, narrowing the row spacing up, improving fertility so we can get better early crop canopy, and then of course using the 3 pre-emerge strategy that we've been outlining for the last couple of years, where we get multiple modes of action, multiple sites of action out early. That's going to improve the length of control in your field until hopefully you get that canopy.
Well, having late season great weed control is important in soybeans and just about any crop, especially if you've got our Weed of the Week. We'll talk about how to control this tough weed coming up later in the show.